October 28, 2017. Your screen is the only light in the room. You are not watching the news. You are not reading an article someone sent you. You are on a board, a dark, anonymous, chaotic board, and you are doing something that feels different from anything you have done online before. You are investigating. A post just appeared, no name attached, no face, just a claim, typed in plain text, that reads like a classified briefing someone left in the wrong place on purpose. HRC extradition already in motion, passport flagged, expect massive riots, operation, begins October 30 at 12:01 a.m. Hillary Clinton, arrested, a specific window, 7:45 to 8:30 a.m. Like someone read it off, a real document. Your cursor blinks. You refresh the page. Nothing new, so you refresh again. That pull you feel, that small electric need to hit the button one more time, that is the exact mechanism this entire story runs on. It is the same loop that keeps a gambler at the machine at 3 a.m. Not the winning, the waiting for it. This is the story of QAnon and how a cryptic post, a digital scavenger hunt, and the need for a hero led to the storming of the US Capitol. To understand what QAnon actually was, you have to forget every tired cliché you know about conspiracy theories. This wasn't a pamphlet slipped under a windshield wiper or a radio host screaming into a microphone for 3 hours. It was something the modern world had never quite seen before, because it was a gamified belief system designed at the architectural level to make you feel like the smartest person in the room. The platform for this was the poll board on 4chan back in October of 2017. If you have never been there, imagine a room with no lights and no names, where voices spend all day screaming and theorizing in total chaos. The site was anonymous by structure and hungry for a story big enough to explain why everything in the world felt so wrong. Then Q appeared. This wasn't a person, but a voice. The user signed off as Q Clearance Patriot for accessing nuclear secrets. The implication was clear that this person knew things they weren't supposed to say. Instead of answers, the account left breadcrumbs. There were names dropped without context. The audience wasn't supposed to just receive the truth, because they were being trained to go out and find it themselves. Researchers call this an alternate reality game, which is a format that hides the fact that it is fictional. The whole aesthetic was built on the idea that this is not a game. When Trump sipped from a water bottle during a speech, thousands of people decoded it as a sign that mass arrests were imminent. Think about what that does to your brain. You aren't just watching a movie anymore, because you have become the detective who is assembling the evidence. Q's drops were engineered to trigger it by being vague enough to mean anything but specific enough to feel real. The cold open already showed you the mechanism. That pull to refresh, that small electric need to hit the button one more time, that is the variable reward loop. Q didn't invent it. When you found a connection between a Trump tweet and a Q drop from 3 weeks earlier, you posted it for the community to see and voted the best interpretations to the top until a crowdsourced reality assembled itself in real time. Your contribution was now part of the story, which meant you hadn't just read a theory. And that feeling, the pride, the purpose, the electric sense that you were one of the few people doing the real work, that was the highest the game ever got. Nothing in ordinary life could touch it. A puzzle room without walls is just a room, but the walls in the world of QAnon were built slowly and quietly. After the early days on 4chan, Q moved the entire operation to new ground. The community followed without hesitation, migrating first to 8chan and then to 8kun. These were platforms with fewer rules, less oversight, and much tighter walls. That the enemy was real, and that the movement was important enough to be hunted. Think about what that did to the people inside. When a platform banned a group, or a journalist called it a conspiracy theory, or a family member said they were worried, they told themselves that, of course, the elites were trying to silence them because the elites were scared of the truth. And the people inside felt like they were the ones who were finally safe. Inside that fortress, a complex system began to develop, did the heavy lifting of turning those scraps into a rigid canon. They cross-referenced cryptic drops with daily news headlines and built elaborate timelines to track the coming storm, creating a crowdsourced theology complete with its own priests. Trust the plan. Those 3 words sound like a call for patience. When nothing happened on a predicted date, you trusted the plan. And when a promised arrest didn't materialize, you trusted the plan again. Even when someone you loved pointed out that none of this made sense, but to dissolve it entirely. Enjoy the show. Dark to light, and nothing can stop what is coming. Don't explain anything. And then came the shift that made leaving feel truly impossible. At some point, the belief stopped being something you held and became something you were. You were waking up early to check for new drops and spending hours on forums decoding and connecting dots, transforming from an ordinary citizen into a digital soldier in a secret war. Every drop you decoded, every connection you posted, every person you recruited, that was your own hand laying the bricks. Psychologists call this phenomenon bounded choice. It isn't that people are unable to see the exit sign. One former believer, who was documented in research on QAnon family estrangement, it felt to her like everyone else was sleepwalking through life, and she wasn't just scrolling through a feed anymore. She was on a crusade. It was the slow, painful disappearance of the person they once knew. The screaming headlines and the footage from the Capitol are visible to everyone. Marriages were fracturing. Adult children were losing their parents, and parents were losing their children to a screen. By the time 2020 arrived, the cage was starting to have a serious recruitment problem. The people already inside were deeply committed, but the message boards were dense, strange, and incredibly alienating to any outsiders. The language was too coded, and the culture was far too hostile for a regular person to join. You basically had to already be a believer just to wade through the digital swamp. So the movement found a new door that almost anyone would be willing to walk through. That door was the safety of children. In the summer of 2020, the Save the Children hashtag exploded across Instagram and changed the face of the movement. It looked like standard social media activism, soft pastel colors, and heart-wrenching photographs of kids. The language focused on trafficking and the failure of big institutions to protect the vulnerable. It spread like wildfire through wellness communities and parenting groups, appearing on the same accounts that posted smoothie recipes and daily gratitude journals. Researchers at Concordia University tracked this specific wave and gave it a name: Pastel QAnon. The aesthetic was a deliberate choice to hide the radical core of the movement, keeping the talk of satanic cabals and ritual abuse exactly one layer back. What they pushed to the front was pure emotion. They tapped into the primal instinct that something was being hidden from you regarding the safety of your children. That instinct isn't a wrong thing to feel. Researchers call it frame bridging, taking a radical ideology and attaching it to beliefs a person already holds dear. You don't start with the strangest parts of the story. You start with something undeniably true. Child trafficking is a real horror. Institutional failures happen every day. Powerful people do abuse their positions. QAnon didn't invent those anxieties. The anti-vaccine fear, the distrust of big pharma, the rage at a government that never seemed to answer for anything, and a map that finally made the chaos feel like it had a shape. Then, one small step at a time, it walked them toward the parts that weren't true at all. Then came the Wayfair hoax, which acted as a massive accelerant. In July of 2020, a claim went viral, saying that a furniture company was listing expensive cabinets with the names of missing children from trafficking databases. And the price discrepancies had very mundane explanations, but the story was perfectly designed for maximum emotional impact. It was specific, it was visual, and it named a company that everyone recognized. It asked you to do your own research, and when you typed those names into a search engine and found matching results, it felt like a personal discovery. That specific feeling is the engine of the entire movement. It isn't about the facts of the claim. It's about the rush of feeling like you found something the elites didn't want you to see, though it was perfect for the growth of the funnel. As COVID and lockdowns began, hundreds of millions of people were suddenly stuck at home, feeling anxious and isolated. They were spending more time online than at any other point in their lives. And between March and June of 2020, QAnon activity nearly tripled on Facebook. It doubled on Instagram and Twitter as well. Nothing drives engagement quite like outrage, fear, and the addictive feeling that you are watching a secret history unfold. People who had never even heard of a Q drop were suddenly deep inside the ecosystem. People who would have laughed at the idea of the storm just 6 months earlier were now sharing Save the Children graphics to their followers and tagging their friends with urgent questions. And this is where everything changed once they were inside the fold. It wasn't enough to just believe the theory anymore, because the movement now required you to take action. You were expected to share the people in your immediate circle. Passive belief was transformed into an active mission, and the moment you sat your sister down to show her a video, you weren't just a follower anymore. At this point, you were the one running the game. They had a specific name for it: the storm. It was a concrete, prophesied event. The script was already written. Mass arrests, military tribunals, thousands of elites, including famous politicians, would be dragged from their homes to face secret courts. At the center of this chaos stood Donald Trump, the man they believed was the secret architect. The storm was always just around the corner. Q had even written that disinformation is necessary to keep the cabal off balance. Every failed arrest meant the operation was still running. Nothing could ever count as evidence. And then came January 2021. Inauguration Day arrived like a hammer blow. The believers were absolutely certain that this was the moment the curtain would finally be pulled back on the deep state. They convinced themselves that Joe Biden's inauguration would never actually happen. Some people truly believed Biden would be handcuffed on the steps of the Capitol, while others thought Trump would emerge at the last second to reclaim his seat, designed to lull the enemy into a false sense of security. They waited for the signal. Biden was sworn in at noon, while the rest of the world watched a perfectly normal ceremony proceed without a single incident. Trump boarded a plane for Florida. The Q account went completely silent. No arrests, no tribunals. But here's the sinister part: a failure that massive should have ended it. When the prophecy doesn't come true, the spell should vanish. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance reduction. Your mind doesn't abandon it when it's proven wrong. And the rule Q had already installed disinformation is necessary, and March 4th became the new date for the revolution. And believers decided it was the real moment Trump would be reinstated as the 19th president. And then another after that. Every missed deadline was absorbed into the narrative as evidence of a longer and deeper plan. And some of the believers didn't just hold on to the edge of the cliff. Think about what that actually means for a person's life. Often losing their families and building entire social worlds inside the movement. To admit that Q was wrong wasn't just a small intellectual mistake. It meant the late nights spent decoding messages and the relationships they sacrificed for the truth. That kind of realization is physically and mentally unbearable for most people. When Trump gave his farewell address, believers noticed there were exactly 17 flags standing behind him. Since Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet, they decided the plan was still running. The storm hadn't failed in their eyes. This is the escape room that locks from the inside, that the room was never real to begin with. And the terrifying question of what comes next is much more frightening than any dark prophecy. But the massive amount of energy it had built up had to go somewhere. That absolute certainty and that electric belief that history was about to break wide open. The energy had been building up like steam in a pressure cooker for weeks. Online, the countdown to the new year had a rhythmic, pounding intensity that you could feel in every forum and Telegram channel. The language of inevitability was everywhere, with people posting that this is it and the storm is finally here. Believers booked flights and hotels, some driving through the night from small towns they had never left in their entire lives. They weren't traveling to Washington, D.C. for a simple political protest. They were traveling to witness a divine revelation. On January 6th, 2021, that digital energy finally translated from the screen to the street, and the game went physical. The belief systems of QAnon were woven directly into the fabric of the crowd that gathered at the Capitol that day. While it's true that not every person there was a hardcore Q follower, the language and symbols of the movement were everywhere you looked. There was a specific kind of certainty in the air, the kind that only comes from years of being told, "You are a soldier in a secret war." They believed history had chosen them specifically to stand on the front lines of the final reckoning. Jacob Chansley walked into the United States Capitol wearing red, white, and blue face paint, along with a horned fur helmet. The cameras found him almost instantly, and his image was exported to the world as the visual shorthand for the entire day. But what those images captured wasn't just a moment of madness, it was costume as theology. This was identity, fusion made literal, where the person and the myth become one. He wasn't just performing for the crowd, he was finally, physically, inside the story he had been living through a screen for years. Douglas Jensen was even more deliberate about his role in the event. He wore a shirt with a massive Q printed on the front because he wanted the movement to get credit for the day's actions. He wanted the historical record to show exactly who had come to the Capitol and who had trusted the plan all the way to the bitter end. The game had always been real to the players, but on January 6th, the only thing that changed was the location of the board. While those violent images were circling the globe, something much quieter and more tragic was happening in homes across the country. On Reddit, a community called QAnon Casualties was being flooded with posts from people who had lost their spouses, parents, and siblings to the movement. Children living in these households were desperately searching for exit strategies, while partners described watching the person they loved for decades turn into a complete stranger. The Capitol was eventually cleared, and the social media accounts were banned, but the deep damage those families were living with didn't get a news cycle. That quiet, domestic damage was always the real story. The platforms moved in after January 6th. Accounts were suspended, groups were wiped, Q went silent. You might assume that silence killed the movement. It didn't. Without a leader, the belief didn't collapse. It decentralized. It drifted into Telegram channels and Truth Social and private group chats, and the 5,000 original drops were treated the way a religion treats its founding texts. Followers didn't need new messages. They had enough scripture to reinterpret forever, mapping the old words onto every new headline until the theory felt more alive than before. The game didn't end, the code just updated. And here is the part that doesn't make the news. When some believers finally hit the wall, when the failed prophecies became too heavy to carry, they didn't walk back into ordinary life. They walked directly into the arms of online recovery communities and de-radicalization influencers who used the exact same psychological architecture, the same variable rewards, the same insider language, the same promise that you were finally seeing what everyone else was missing. The cage had a new coat of paint, but the lock was identical. This is the mechanism that never stops running, because it was never really about Q. It was never really about Trump, or the cabal, or the children. It was about the refresh button. It was about that small electric pull you felt the moment a pattern appeared in the noise, the feeling that you had found something real in a world that felt hollow and random. That feeling is not a flaw. It is deeply, fundamentally human. And the people who build these systems know exactly how it works. Go back to where this story started. A dark room, a screen, a post that appeared with no name attached and no face behind it. A specific claim, typed in plain text, that felt like it was left in the wrong place on purpose. The cursor blinked, you refreshed, and then you refreshed again. That loop is still running right now. The escape room is always open for new players, and it never announces itself as a game. It announces itself as the truth. The cage doesn't close with a sound. That is exactly the point. If this story made you think of someone, share it with them. Drop a comment below. What was the moment that stood out to you? And subscribe, because next time we go deeper into the machinery of belief. Because awareness, that's your armor.